hopefully I won't need all that. Andrew Gottlieb, the Executive Director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. Appreciate the invitation to speak to you tonight to share our perspective on regional issues and how they generally pertain to the town of Barnstable. So we've put out a lot of information in the last year, and I'll start the most recent and work my way back. We annually evaluate water quality through our State of the Waters report, which evaluates and grades public water supply quality, estuarine quality, and freshwater ponds. And the summary of what we found is that in the estuarine world, as was the case last year, 90% of the 53 estuaries, 48 of the 53 estuaries on Cape Cod exhibit poor water quality. That's reflective of nutrient enrichment, largely from inadequately treated wastewater from residential septic systems. Our report was also 90% failure rate last year. All the same ones failed. None got better. And as compared to the 5-year ago report when we first did this, only 68% of the estuaries failed at that point. So every single south-facing estuary in Cape Cod, all but one down in Woods Hole on the Buzzards Bay side, and all but 4 on the north side, including Barnstable Harbor, exhibit poor water quality at some stations within that water body at some point in the year. And it's all driven by, largely because most of our land use is residential activity. The lion's share of it, 80 to 85%, is excess nitrogen from septic systems, legal, performing to design septic systems are inadequate to address the nutrient reductions needed to provide healthy marine waters. Septic systems do essentially nothing to remove nitrogen from wastewater, and over the decades, we've seen an increase along with residential development, the number of people, the number of septic systems, and it's important to pay attention to the change in use pattern of existing properties, whereby existing properties are used either for longer periods of time, as there's been a migration of people to the Cape, so a conversion of properties that have been developed but lightly used over the years, and increased intensity of use associated with short-term rental. So, you generate a lot more wastewater when there's 12 people in a house for a week than 4. And if you have 10, 12 weeks of that, it adds up. So that is largely attributable, or the further decline in estuarine health is largely attributable to ongoing increased loadings of septic waste into the ground. While this year's report shows at the gross level no significant increase in the number of estuarine resources that are degraded, what it does show is an increase in the number of stations that are degraded. So think about it this way. These estuaries sort of die from the head down. What water quality degrades first at the farthest end near shore, away from the openings to the embayment, where there's exchange of relatively low nutrient water from Nantucket Sound, Barnstable Harbor, or Cape Cod Bay, or Buzzards Bay, and degrades as it moves further up. What we've seen in resources that are already degraded is that fewer and fewer stations closer and closer to the opening of the estuaries exhibit good water quality. I gave a talk in Mashpee 4 hours ago. Papaneset Bay, there are no stations that exhibit high water quality anymore, a shared resource between Mashpee and Barnstable. Wacoit Bay has one. And that is fairly typical. So even though, even though a number of towns, Barnstable a leader among them, have invested a lot, begun to invest and accelerate existing investments in wastewater infrastructure, there's a time lag. It takes time from the time you authorize these projects for them to get built, and it takes time once they're built to get people connected, and it's only until and unless people connect that you begin to see a reduction of the input of nutrients into the environment. Everything that's in the environment, in the groundwater, has to flush itself through these systems. So there's a legacy impact that even once you stop, you'll continue to see loadings remain relatively high compared to what the resources can handle. So there's a time lag. It doesn't mean the investments aren't worth making, because until and unless you stop adding the nutrient, you're never going to get better. And it doesn't mean that the investments aren't working. There just is a time lag. So towns are in the position of having to make meaningful investments in water quality and wait a little while to see improvement. So that's what we're seeing in the estuarine environment. I think every one of Barnstable's estuaries are impaired to a greater or lesser degree, including Barnstable Harbor and some of the really inshore locations, which surprises a lot of people and really disappointed us last year when that happened. On the pond side, there are 890 freshwater ponds on the Cape. There's not great data for most of them. So the results of our sampling and our analysis limited to about 150 ponds for which there was about 3 years worth of data. That's no older than the oldest of which, the newest of which is no older than 2017. So we need 3 years of data, and it can't be more than 5 years old. Otherwise, you're sort of telling people what something looked like a long time ago or on inadequate data. And for the ponds, about 39%, and that's pretty steady year over year, 39% of the ponds that we look at and have enough data to analyze exhibit poor water quality. That number stays consistent. However, which ponds comprise that 39% changes a lot from year to year. There are a handful of ponds that exhibit problems year after year after year. Some frequent flyers, you can just death and taxes. You know Santuit Pond's going to go green, and it's going to stay that way for much of the summer. Other ponds are kind of marginal. They're under stress, and they're under stress in the exact same thing the estuaries are under stress from, which is residential activity, septics, fertilizers, stormwater runoff. Those are the three boogeymen when it comes to fresh and saltwater water quality on Cape Cod. And more than 50% of the ponds are marginal. They're under stress, and depending upon the local conditions, in any given year, confluence of events might either make that pond go bad or keep it just okay. A lot of the thinking has to do with these heavy rainstorm events that are now, used to be the exception, are now the rule under an altered climate. You have 3, 4, 5-inch rainstorms in a 2-hour period that are pretty common now, but they're not distributed equally. So it can be raining like hell in Centerville and dry on the Yarmouth border, right? And if you hit a pond with a big washout, with a lot of stormwater runoff, a lot of runoff coming off the road, after the fertilizer trucks have been by, you know, you can get a big pulse in that pond and it can tip. Pond on the other end of town, the other end of the Cape, might not have gotten that same rainstorm. It might not have been visited by the fertilizer folks on the same schedule, you know, so we just don't have a great handle on that. The other thing that's contributing to all of this, but particularly in the freshwater world, is increased temperature. It's a warmer world. It's a warmer world, and it's a wetter world as a result of it, but cyanobacteria, which is one of the primary drivers of poor water quality in the freshwater world that we're learning a lot more about, are uniquely well suited to outcompete other forms of aquatic life at high temperature. So if you want to grow plants at home, you do two things. You feed them and you put them in a warm environment. And we've done both those things. We locally control the nutrient loading. You can choose wastewater intervention, improve wastewater treatment. You can choose not to fertilize. Town can choose to remove direct discharges of stormwater from these waterways, rely on green infrastructure to take nutrients out of the stormwater before it finds its way into the groundwater. So there's a lot we control on the nutrient load side. We don't control temperature, and we don't control rainfall. So, a lot of our thinking and recommendations around this is to control what you can control. And so that's sort of a lot of the counsel that we have around the freshwater world. We're doing some work with both the Cape Cod Commission and our partners at NOAA and EPA to match up actual measured water quality in these ponds with satellite imagery, so that at the same time there's a satellite going overhead, we're out there taking a water sample, and we're trying to draw calibrations between the way the pond looks from the sky and what the water quality sample tells us, so that we can associate those colors with density of cyanobacteria blooms. It allows us to do two things. Allow us to be much more widely cover where we're doing sampling, because we can get an image, look at it and go, these ponds are at risk, these ones aren't. Let's go sample the ones that are at risk and not sample the ones that aren't. That helps, and it also will allow us to answer the question, are things getting worse? Or has it always been like this? And since we've only been looking at cyano for 5 or 6 years, we know what it looked like 5 or 6 years ago, but beyond that, we don't really know. We think it's worse, but if we draw the correlation between cyano blooms and color, we can actually go back to the historic record of satellites over decades and look and see what they said, and it'll give us some insights into what history looked like. So it gives us the ability to understand a little bit how development patterns have changed and how those changes may or may not have impacted water quality. The operating presumption is that it impacts it a lot, right? But so that's where we are on the freshwater world. We are doing sampling on contract with the town of Barnstable again this year on about 35 ponds in Barnstable for cyano, roughly Memorial Day, most of them through Labor Day, a handful a little bit later in the season, depending on which pond it is. Barnstable is the single largest pond cluster that we do in any given town, any of the 15 towns. So we have a fair bit of data, and that's all provided in that State of the Waters report, should you want to dig into that and see what's going on. On the water supply side, it's a substantially different story. There are 21 public water suppliers providing water to customers on Cape Cod. You have the honor of having 5 of them in Barnstable. All of them provide water at the entry to their system that is either good or excellent. And, what we are seeing on the water supply end is that there are no public water supply systems in the year we evaluated, which was 2022 data for our 2023 report, that had exceedances of regulated compounds above state and federal drinking water standards. That said, 10 of the 21 had PFAS below standard in their water. So Massachusetts regulates 6 of roughly 15,000 PFAS compounds in drinking water, which is 6 more than 48 other states do. So of the 6 regulated, nobody's providing water, putting water into the system that exceeded a PFAS number. But it's out there. And it's out there in a couple of cases for very discrete, clear sources, Fire Training Academy being one. A lot of people said different things about the airport. So some open questions about that. Certainly, Joint Base Cape Cod has an enormous PFAS load that has taken out wells in the town of Mashpee and the town of Falmouth already, and for which there's no clear assessment of the amount of PFAS in the water, in the ground, and no containment plan in place yet to maintain it from migrating off base, or if it does migrate off base, catching it and cleaning it up before it enters public water supplies. So the focus then of the analysis we've done on the water side brings us largely to nutrient management, both for fresh and marine waters. It's fair to say that every town in Cape Cod, as part of and a reaction to the county's 208 area-wide water quality plan focus their nutrient load reduction programs around improving their individual estuaries. And to the extent that mitigation of nutrient loading on a freshwater pond was called for in any of those plans, it was to reduce the nitrogen load that ultimately ended up in the bay, whichever bay, not necessarily to improve the quality of the pond. And there is not a town on the Cape that has a particularly good handle on what the needs of its freshwater resources are for restoration of degraded ones, protection and maintenance of those that are already not degraded. That's kind of the next thing. The county, we at APCC had suggested 2 years ago at the county that it was an appropriate time to begin to look at the freshwater questions. So they launched something called the Freshwater Initiative last year, which is, and we APCC are under contract to the county to do freshwater sampling in 50 representative ponds across the 15 towns to try to get baseline water quality data, help us characterize ponds at a high level, which ones are dominated by external nutrient loading and would benefit immediately from reductions, sewering around those water bodies, which ones are driven by internal recycling of phosphorus and nitrogen in their sediment base that even if you eliminate all the incoming, you'd still have a water quality problem, and to develop a set of recommendations about, depending on which category your pond is, what you would do from a sort of a no regrets management perspective that would put you directionally toward improving the level of protection provided to that pond, even if you don't have a detailed understanding of the exact nature of how much you have to reduce loading the way you do on all the estuaries. So that work is ongoing. We started year one last April. We're doing the second of 3 years of sampling this year. That data is being provided from year one to the requisite town natural resources agencies in the coming short period, next several weeks. It's been conveyed by will be conveyed by the commission to the towns and will be publicly available. And that's going to be an emerging area. So I think one of the things to really think about is, I know you're spending a lot of money on estuarine restoration through expansion of the sewer system, and we think that's the right way to go. You're going to need to look at your freshwater resources too. And part of that's going to add increasing the sewer area that you need to do. Some of it might provide you the opportunity to look differently at a given layout and trying to get like a twofer, that if you can take load out of an area around a pond that's going to find its way through largely surface waters, run through a river, perhaps in a day from that pond to the estuary, you can get the benefit of the phosphorus reduction in the freshwater resource and the reduction in nutrient and nitrogen loading to those estuaries downstream for the expenditure of the same dollar. And so it might ask towns to begin to think about rethinking a little bit how they're doing. I don't want that to at all come across as a basis upon which to delay ongoing expansion. We are way behind the curve as a broader community on wastewater management. We're still largely in the 18th century, frankly, for most homes that are reliant on septic systems in one form or another. And so, there's no reason I don't want it to be interpreted as, we have to stop because we have to look at this. Most of what you're doing, you're going to have to do anyway, and you can probably make some differences around the edges by thinking about freshwater resources differently. The other thing I want to touch base on a little bit is we did two complementary pieces of work. One was this Grow Smart Cape Cod initiative that we did in partnership with the Housing Assistance Corporation a couple years ago, where we were looking for what areas are high priority natural resource habitat areas that, from our perspective, warrant additional protection. What areas are more appropriate for higher density development that, when paired with, and this is a really important point, when paired with wastewater infrastructure, provides the opportunity to both see water quality improvements and provide the treatment capacity needed to support a higher density that would otherwise if put in without advanced wastewater treatment, further degrade water resources. So we came up with maps for each one of the 15 towns that identify those areas that are highest priority for resource protection, those areas that are appropriate where there's overlap between infrastructure and housing density, and those areas that, if wastewater were extended to them, would become high priority, but are not because the landscape cannot support higher densities without advanced wastewater treatment technology. So we've been working on that, and talking to each one of the 15 towns, and came up with a series of town-specific recommendations for regulatory, whether it's zoning or code changes that would facilitate directing development to those areas that can sustain it while focusing people on those areas that are best suited to additional protections. The part of the premise here is we'd like to identify the areas where we shouldn't be fighting with the housing world. In other words, we shouldn't be fighting when there's a high priority contiguous habitat area that's a good place to preserve, and we shouldn't be fighting all density everywhere when it's not going to be on land that is undisturbed but is underdeveloped or could benefit from some intensity of redevelopment, given that it's a low priority habitat. So that's a theory behind it. It's kind of sort of worked sometimes. We still fight a bit. That piece of work then led to another report that you can find on our website called Hanging in the Balance. And so the work we did with HAC made us take a hard look at, well, what's left, right? So and what we determined was there's 14% of the land mass of Cape Cod that is both unprotected and undeveloped. And there's a lot of assumptions that people make about that land that reality, ownership, zoning, and building codes don't support. So it doesn't really matter if it's always been green space, unless it's got permanent protections associated with it, Article 97 lands that are publicly owned or lands that are deed restricted in the hands of conservation organizations or CRs in the hand of private landowners. The zoning will tell you what can happen to it. And of that 14% of the Cape, that's about 60,000 acres. 80% of its critical habitat is defined by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the premise behind the report is we know what the existing development patterns have brought us. Existing development patterns, heavily reliant on single-family detached dwellings, have resulted in lousy water quality, traffic, high housing prices, fragmented landscape. And we step back and say, if that's what the existing pattern got you for how we've handled the existing 86% that's either protected or developed, why would you want to treat the last 14% the same way? And if you choose to treat it that way, why are you going to think you're going to get anything different than what you've already got? And so we've been using the Hanging in the Balance report to work on a pilot basis with a number of our land trust partners to come up with, define, and implement strategies to enable more aggressive protection of that 14% of critical habitat that requires protection. Some of it is already in municipal hands. Just because it's municipally owned without Article 97 protections doesn't mean it can't be developed. Doesn't mean it can't be repurposed for some other activity. So we're working with land trusts to help them figure out within the lands that are publicly owned, the public already spent the money on them. Are they protected? Are the right lands protected? And if they're not protected, what are the methods necessary? And it's different in Barnstable because of your governance forum, but for the other 14 towns, what is the town meeting process and what are the levers that individuals can use to move lands that should be protected in public ownership into the right category? And then similarly to focus land acquisition activities, both are by towns and land trusts to focus on those areas that warrant that additional protection. Do I think all 40,000 of that acres are going to get protected? No. But, a substantial amount of it should be if we want to see some of the benefits of the improvements that we're working to find on water quality by investing in sewer. So a lot of our work on that regard is going to be focused on that. And it's led us to be working in the context of the housing bond bill that the Governor Healy's administration has filed, because we really see some nexus between housing policy and wastewater policy. And part of the argument we've been making is that you can make all the changes in the world you want to the zoning authorizations, but lacking the wastewater infrastructure capacity, those changes are not going to result in different outcomes. And so if you want to see different outcomes, you have to pair those two things and have them work more in tandem, as long as you get a benefit from the water quality investment. So that's kind of the world as we see it at a high level around, you know, land use and water resource protection. You know, the simple truth for us is that, you know, sort of the original sin, if you will, was the reliance on single-family detached homes on Cape Cod as the land protection methodology. It has done none of those things. And, you know, at the same time, you know, so where it's led us is to focus on how you repurpose that which is already heavily disturbed to be more productive, and how you look at capturing and recapturing affordability of existing housing stock, as opposed to putting all your chips on the table, which some of the people we work with in the housing world have done on a build your way out of it strategy. Quite simply, it is our view that you cannot build your way out of the housing crisis on Cape Cod and have Cape Cod resemble anything like you'd want to be at anymore. You know, no one has put a number on how many additional single-family homes or dwelling units you'd have to have in order to change the market such that there's no longer sufficient pressure on any starter home that might still be there to be McMansionized, or to have the development community see adequate profit in smaller homes that have less of a footprint, but it's got to be in the tens of thousands. And we don't view the resources of the Cape as being able to sustain that level of development. So it leads us back to the question of, do we not have enough housing units, or do we not have enough housing units that are readily accessible to the broad spectrum of potential homeowners on the Cape, enhanced by the addition of a new type of housing typology that requires some height and provides an opportunity for people at the either end of the age and income spectrums to have a place to live that doesn't require, you know, care and feeding of an acre of property. And that if you can find that sweet spot, you can deal with a lot of the problem. So a lot of our emphasis around natural resources protection comes from a desire to help set housing policy. And we've commented extensively on this to the Cape Cod Commission through their housing, regional housing plan, is to really emphasize mechanisms that divert money that might otherwise go to production to the acquisition of deed-restricted interest in existing house, and repurpose existing dwellings such that the affordability is built into the deed, and that people at range of end of the income spectrum can afford to live there. That type of repurposing has the lightest environmental incremental footprint, because you're just repurposing what's already there. And if you add wastewater infrastructure, you can minimize the impact of those homes and the year-round nature of those homes from further impacting water resources. So we're putting a lot of effort, and I think it's something that's worth thinking about as you think through your plan, on the relative weights and value of providing more housing stock to meet the needs of your community and not get sucked down the road by the siren song of production, because there's another way. And we haven't heard any discussion of effective methods to take that which is put into production and prevent the market forces that have distorted the rest of the housing market from sucking those in and having them behave in the same economic fashion as the diverse universe of individual housing. So I don't know how long I talk, but I'll stop.
No, that was good. Probably have a couple of questions from people on the dais, but one quick question, Andrew, the deed restrictions of existing houses that would attain affordability, how long does that take? Has anyone done any analysis of?
I can't answer your question directly, Wendy. I think that we've been pushing this as a policy priority through the commission's work. The bigger impediment that we see is that it's no one's job to do it. Whose responsibility is it in the town of Barnstable, the town of Mashpee, Barnstable County, to obtain an affordability and retain the affordability stake in existing dwellings? They have, similar program, Vail, Colorado, deals with a lot of the same issues that we do. They're bounded by mountains, but it functions as the ocean too. You're right, same thing. And they have an agency whose job it is to acquire deed restricted interests in housing to maintain long-term affordability. And they do. I don't know how effective it is. They do more of it than we do, because somebody shows up at work every day, and it's their job to figure that out. We lack that on Cape Cod. What we lack is a bunch of inadequate tools that are sort of rooted in the existing system that we have that's led us to where we are. And we're trying to tweak it, throw a lot more money at it, but so what? It's not, I haven't heard anything that makes me feel any better other than investing in maintaining affordability makes me feel any better about the strategies that are out there.
Thanks. Okay, who would like to ask questions? Mark?
Thank you. Just a question. Do you think that a transition from overburdened private septic systems, let's say for the majority of, there's probably a good portion of the Cape that rents, I'm talking full-time rentals, not short-term, but moving to areas where there is infrastructure, where there can be density, do you think that would that have to be significant in order to have an effect? I mean, I think there are a lot of the dwellings that have more than, they have heavy loads, obviously more people living in them than it should be.
It's really hard. I think it's treacherous and basically impossible to get into the business as a municipality of regulating intensity of use. You can put it on the books. Ability to enforce it is pretty limited. So I think where you have relatively dense single-family, rented or owned, owner-occupied, those are probably going to be pretty good areas for sewer extension. The denser, vertical, affordable, whether it's market rate, affordable, but it's small, so it is affordable, or subsidized capital A affordable, are almost always going to have to be on infrastructure. There's no particular on-site system that could allow you to have any type of multifamily density that relies on septic systems.
So there are no real emerging technologies currently that you believe that would be able to do that on a private level, just a single family?
So on the single family side, there's promising technology that has meaningful reductions from existing load numbers. As a rough cut example, the average south-facing estuary, of which Barnstable has, half a dozen, can handle about 3 milligrams per liter of nitrogen before going belly up. Most of the current alternative nitrogen-reducing septic systems get you a credit down to 19 from somewhere in the 40s. So big difference. Big difference from 45 to 19. You're still a long way from 3. The emerging technologies that are being piloted now, from what I'm hearing, get you into the high single digits, some indication that they're getting into the mid single digits. That gets you a lot closer. So, as yet, unless you want to do a composting toilet, an incinerating toilet, or a urine diversion in your home, there isn't anything that competes with municipal collection and treatment and a disposal outside the watershed in many instances that gets you down to the level that a lot of these water bodies are going to need. Some of these estuaries, and you have a handful that are in this category, Mashpee we do too, need 100% removal of existing loads in order to get better. Any on-site system has some residual. And so, by definition, they get you closer to the water quality target, but I haven't seen the magic bullet on-site yet.
Okay. And just as a matter of time, I just had one last question. So it sounds like when you were speaking that the majority of this comes down to funding, that they're just, these projects are extremely expensive and or need to be heavily subsidized. Do you think the focus of a town should be to identify funding sources, alternative outside of just property taxes, that can be sustainable moving forward in order to fund these? Do you think that needs to be a focus where money may, in fact, speed up the correction or the ability to improve infrastructure?
I'll answer it this way. The ability to effectively, in a reasonable time period, which is a generational time period, requires a lot of money and a lot of conscious forethought by each town on how it wants to structure a financing plan. There are 15 different towns, and there are probably 20 different approaches in those 15 towns to financing it. Some towns put a lot of them on betterments. Some towns put none on betterments, put it all on tax rate. Some towns reserve their meals tax, short-term rental tax, other discretionary non-property tax-based funds, funnel it into infrastructure. Others put it entirely on the tax base. And I would say the only thing that we would preach to a town is not how to do it, but they need to think through the financing plan, and they need to make some conscious, hard choices about the need to prioritize wastewater finance over other stuff. And what that other stuff is going to be highly variable by community, but it's not going to happen by accident. The other thing I'll just point out, because as Wendy knows, once you get me talking about wastewater money, I can talk your face off. There are tools available to Cape Cod towns for financing wastewater that are unavailable to the other 336 municipalities in Massachusetts. Prevalence of zero-interest loans from the state, primarily focused around Cape Cod. Not exclusive, but it's designed for us. Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund doesn't exist anywhere else in the Commonwealth. The existence of the Water Infrastructure Fund, the WIFs, statewide, but used more on Cape Cod than anywhere else. The ability to dedicate meals and lodging taxes was a big boon that a lot of towns, Barnstable included, segregated out and dedicated towards infrastructure. So you had something, some towns just kind of let it go up into the ether in their general operating budget, and they have nothing to show for it. That was a mistake. So as these tools that the governor has proposed come, whether they come to bear or not, but if they do, towns really need to think about, are we going to put that into our general operating budget and have it disappear, or are we going to dedicate it towards this priority item and put ourselves in a position of not having to ask for every last nickel to come from the property tax base?
Good question, Mark.
Thank you.
Asia.
So you mentioned a lot of very interesting things. Thank you so much for your presentation. I actually really loved it. It gave me a lot of information. So this is a three-part question, but the first part is, if we eliminated septic systems completely, wouldn't that make it so that the water quality stays good? And can't we get private developers who are trying to build in our region to take money from the project that they're trying to develop if it has multiple housing units and say that they have to pay for the sewer in that neighborhood?
So
Something of that
the
approach?
predicate to your question, if you got rid of all the septic system waste and had, high-level advanced wastewater treatment, you would see radical improvements in water quality across the board.
Okay.
That said, the Cape as a whole, you probably can get away with about half the septic systems on the Cape remaining if you target the infrastructure and the treatment and collection around the highest priority areas that are providing the greatest load. So some towns, only really one, Chatham, and Provincetown's inching this way, have decided to sewer the whole town. Not because they need to sewer the whole town to meet water quality objectives. They actually overprotect, which is great. Less nutrients in the environment's a great thing. But because the community wanted it, and it made their choice of financing more equitable in the eyes of the people who are making the decision. So they're doing a plan that has them pretty much doing everything. Whether they will or not by the end of the day, I don't know. They might not. But other towns, you know, again, depending on which estuarine watershed you're in, you know, you might have to get it all out. So that's part of it. So more treatment's good than less. You know, the idea about how you engage your development community in contributing is really going to be variable based on the community. You know, it's one conversation if they're building proximate to an existing sewer line, or they can provide the resources to tie a neighborhood that you might otherwise want to get in. That's a valuable asset for them to work with you on to negotiate contribution. That might advance your program. In other instances, you know, they might be putting something in a place that is low priority for you, in which case, you know, you'd want to have them do more advanced. And the technology around small facilities being able to achieve lower levels of reduction is getting better. You know, the permit standard's 10. That's not good enough. A lot of the new municipal facilities can get you down to 3, which is what you need. Mashpee's is going to be at 3. Orleans is already at 3. So that's kind of the standard you build to. Whether the individual development can get there or not, you know, a little bit questionable. You know, a good strategy is to, you know, if it can't, have that development pick up existing septic systems on the fringes of it so that you're ending up with a net reduction. Even if the treatment milligram per liter load is higher than you might want, if you're treating enough of an existing load, you can bring it down below the base. So there's a number of different strategies to work with the development community on.
Thank you.
Okay, Lindsay.
In your experience, have you seen any, Barnstable is one of those communities that's going to have a mixed setup. You know, coastal embayments, planning for that. We have large areas of town that are going to be left out of that system that have ponds. Mm-hmm. Have you seen in your experience that perhaps cluster systems in those areas for pond water quality, or perhaps some of these in-pond treatments that are being proposed now, would be successful in these isolated areas?
Yeah, I mean, so something's better than nothing, and it's hard to get people to pay twice. So if you're going to do one of these middling steps, you need to do the analysis to understand whether you're reducing enough load to make a difference. Because it's really hard if you say, we're going to do a package plan, publicly owned, at this one location here, and then all of a sudden find, well, it didn't actually do the trick. Why didn't it do the trick? Well, maybe it didn't do the trick because you still had a lot of stormwater runoff from private properties as well as municipal storm drains that you didn't deal with. So deal with that. You know, what's that load look like? What does the internal recycling of phosphorus in that pond look like? You know, is there a big phosphorus load in the sediments and it's turning over every year because the pond's losing oxygen because you get the warm layers and, you know, you get the stratification of top layers from the bottom layers? You know, you need to, before you start to make those kind of decisions, you need to probably really understand what's driving quality in that particular lake. You know, the premise that less is better is true, but it might not be enough given the specific. And you know, like I said, asking people to pay twice is a tough ask. I mean, the one thing people can do today that costs nobody anything, just stop fertilizing your lawns.
Yes.
Right? It's not going to solve the problem.
You just got to cut the grass.
It's, well, if you don't fertilize it so much, it's not going to grow so
What I'm
fast.
saying.
But, you know, it's not going to solve the problem. It might keep a pond that's marginal from going bad on a given year, but but it costs you actually less than nothing. It saves you money. You're not buying the stuff. You're not paying somebody to put it down. You're not paying somebody, in most cases, to come cut the grass that they spurred to grow when they put the fertilizer down in the first place. So if you want to start something today around your pond, decide that you're just going to let your lawn go, buy some seed of white clover, let a little bit of moss grow in the lawn, and you'll be fine. You'll be fine.
On that note, we good for this part of the presentation?
Well, now you're talking my language. No fertilizer, no pesticides. Let the little animals grow, and maybe they'll help eat some of the stuff in the pond. And I'm sorry to do this to you, Andrew, but there's a small elephant in the room, and it would be great to hear from you if you have a point of view in terms of some of the wind farm stuff and the potential impact on our water.
I mean, we have a very well-formed view of it, and it's in writing. It's available on our site. And we commented extensively on the project. We look for certain types of mitigation that, especially around, spill prevention that, goes well above what's in place for all other like and similar facilities that exist already on the Cape. And, we found that the mitigation was appropriate and commented to that effect. So there's no lack of clarity on what we think, and we have not shied away from saying it.